Hi everyone, this video covers Descartes' fifth meditation, and here the title is Of the Essence of Material Things and again of God, that He exists. I will leave a link to the version I'm using here down below in the description. So he starts right off talking about the essence of geometrical shapes. He says, as for example, when I imagine a triangle, although there is not perhaps and never was in any place in the universe apart from my thought one such figure, it remains true, nevertheless, that this figure possesses a certain determinate nature, form, or essence, which is immutable and eternal, and not framed by me, nor in any degree dependent on my thought, as appears from the circumstance that diverse properties of the triangle may be demonstrated, namely, that its three angles are equal to 2 right. He says, I now clearly discern to belong to it, although before I did not at all think of them, when for the first time I imagined a triangle, and which accordingly cannot be said to have been invented by me. So the idea is that he has in his mind this idea of a triangle, and by idea of a triangle he has the mathematical or geometrical definition of a triangle in his mind, namely that this shape has three angles that add up to 180 degrees, or as he lists here, different ways of defining it, but that he couldn't have come up with these on his own. This idea is almost just forced upon him. It's not something that he could have constructed, and he didn't learn this from his experience. It's just that this idea is impressed on his mind, and so he comes to the conclusion that there must be some sort of true essence to triangleness, even if there is no true triangle out there in nature. He says, I'm able to form in thought an innumerable variety of figures with regard to which it cannot be supposed that they were ever objects of sense. For example, consider a chiliagon, a 1,000-sided figure, which he will use as an example in the next meditation. He continues, and I can nevertheless demonstrate diverse properties of their nature no less than of the triangle, all of which are assuredly true, since I clearly conceive them. He then turns his focus to the idea of God. He says, but now if because I can draw from my thought the idea of an object, it follows that all I clearly and distinctly apprehend to pertain to this object does in truth belong to it. May I not from this derive an argument for the existence of God? It is certain that I no less find the idea of God in my consciousness, that is, the idea of a being supremely perfect, than that of any figure or number whatever. And I know with not less clearness and distinctness that an actual and eternal existence pertains to his nature, than that all which is demonstrable of any figure or number really belongs to the nature of that figure or number. And, therefore, although all the conclusions of the preceding meditations were false, the existence of God would pass with me for a truth at least as certain as I ever judged any truth of mathematics to be. So, taking the idea of God as his attention, he considers how just as in a triangle there are certain characteristics or parts of the definition that seem essential to triangleness. When he thinks about the definition of God as a perfect being, a supremely perfect being, he cannot imagine an idea like this without the characteristic of existence. So that if he could think of an idea that he would define as God without the notion that this being exists, then it would not be God that he had in mind. He says, it appears that the existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the idea of a mountain from that of a valley, or the equality of its three angles to 2 right angles from the essence of a rectilinear triangle, so that it is not less impossible to conceive a God, that is, a being supremely perfect, to whom existence is a wanting, or who is devoid of a certain perfection, than to conceive of a mountain without a valley. So that it is in the very idea of God that he exists, just as it is in the idea of a mountain that there is also a valley, and that in the idea of a triangle that there are three angles that add up to 180 degrees. It is just that obvious, or it presses itself that clearly on the mind when you think of the idea of God. He says, not that this is brought about by my thought, or that it imposes any necessity on things, but on the contrary, the necessity which lies in the thing itself, that is, the necessity of the existence of God, determines me to think in this way. For it is not in my power to conceive a God without existence, that is, a being supremely perfect and yet devoid of an absolute perfection, as I am free to imagine a horse with or without wings. So again, he's saying that this idea of God comes with it the idea of perfection, and that it is impossible to conceive of God as such, as a perfect being, without the idea that this very God exists. In the latter part of the meditation, he starts on to a slightly different topic. He says, it is only the things I clearly and distinctly conceive which have the power of completely persuading me. So he considers, what about those times when he's not actually focused on these ideas and his mind drifts on to other things? He says, yet because my constitution is also such as to incapacitate me from keeping my mind continually fixed on the same object, and as I frequently recollect a past judgment without at the same time being able to recall the grounds of it, it may happen meanwhile that other reasons are presented to me which would readily cause me to change my opinions. He says, for example, when I consider the nature of the rectilinear triangle, it most clearly appears to me, who have been instructed in the principle of geometry, that its three angles are equal to two right angles. And I find it impossible to believe otherwise while I apply my mind to the demonstration. But as soon as I cease from attending to the process of proof, although I still remember that I had a clear comprehension of it, yet I may readily come to doubt of the truth demonstrated. So he's considering this experience that he has when he focuses on something and he has a clear and distinct idea of it. He notices that when his gaze goes on to something else, then he sometimes forgets how certain he was of that thing. Does that mean that he is less certain, that he has less knowledge, or that he has less of a clear and distinct idea of these things? He thinks not, because, as he says in this, as he continues, but after I have discovered that God exists, seeing I also at the same time observe that all things depend on him, and that he is no deceiver, and thence inferred that all which I clearly and distinctly perceive is of necessity true, although I no longer attend to the grounds of a judgment, no opposite reason can be alleged sufficient to lead me to doubt of its truth, provided only I remember that I once possessed a clear and distinct comprehension of it. So, because he now knows that God exists, and that God is perfect, and that God is good, and would not want to deceive him, he can now trust that everything he has in the past come to through a clear and distinct idea. He can trust that those in fact were that way, and that he can trust his memory that he did in fact see things clearly and distinctly. He wraps up this meditation saying, and thus I very clearly see that the certitude and truth of all science depends on the knowledge alone of the true God, insomuch that before I knew him, I could have no perfect knowledge of any other thing. And now that I know him, I possess the means of acquiring perfect knowledge respecting innumerable matters, as well relative to God himself and other intellectual objects as to corporeal nature, insofar as it is an object of pure mathematics, which do not consider whether it exists or not. So he now has the material world, he now has at least the shapes, the geometrical shapes in their essences. He has knowledge of that, all because he believes that God exists. He thinks he has a clear and distinct idea of God, and a proof for God's existence in this fifth meditation. I hope you found that helpful.